Okay, good morning, Gabriel. Actually, I should say good evening. Where are you?
Oh, I'm in London and it is evening, but good morning, and yeah, good evening, good morning,
Yeah,
hello, hello,
thank you.
Australia.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
Uh, can you just tell me briefly, I mean, what is the COVID situation like at the moment for you?
It's quite grim, and we can't. We've got another total sort of lockdown nationwide now, having had a very complicated system of by area about what you could and couldn't do. Um, the situation in London is particularly bad, I think, with infections and hospital admissions and deaths, but it is starting to kind of improve in London. But it's all a bit grim, really. So we can't really
Uh,
do anything. We're not supposed to go out.
how does that affect you as a composer?
Well, the first time round, I found it actually weirdly really difficult. Even though actually, when I've got a lot of work to do, not going out or not going further than the supermarket at the end of the street is quite normal. Somehow, because one couldn't, do anything other than that. I don't know. I found it very. I think a lot of musicians, a lot of artists, and stuff found this. It was very difficult at first to kind of get work done, even though in some ways my circumstances weren't really any different from how they often are. But once I got the hang of that, and I think it's just because of that, I don't know, that all that total of uncertainty that kind of envelops everything. But I sort of eventually got the hang of kind of dealing with that, and now actually, it's now lockdown number three, uh, really, in the UK. It's fine.
Yeah, I should just point out for everyone listening that the Mass of St. James was written during your first lockdown, I think it was, wasn't it?
Most of it was, yeah, most of it was,
So
most
that
of it
was a
was.
difficult time for you, I think.
It was really difficult, and yeah, I mean, as I say, because even though as I say, even working at staying at home and not doing anything other than work, it's not that weird for me. Uh, Somehow, it just well, I couldn't concentrate. I couldn't think straight about what I was trying to do. It was very strange. It was very strange. I mean, did you find that
So
you couldn't focus on
yeah. I mean, planning,
what you needed to do?
decision making was really difficult to. I mean, it threw us all, I think, didn't it?
A lot of people,
None of
you
us.
see a lot of people kind of, gloating on social media. I found about how they've been incredibly productive and I've done this and I've done that. But actually, most people in our profession that I spoke to found it, the same thing. Actually, that they were not very productive, and it was very difficult.
It's very difficult, the
Strange.
uncertainty of it all.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
let's wind the clock back. 2016, the choir of St James went on their fantastic European tour, and we sang for a week in Westminster Abbey. And I think it was at the Sanctuary Hotel, Sanctuary Pub, just outside Westminster Abbey, that I met you along with Brooke Shelley from the choir.
Yeah.
And we spent a very happy 2 or 3 hours, and several bottles later.
Well, we
Uh,
initially met, didn't we, in the refectory of the abbey, with no alcohol, but that was quite a brief stay in there, as I recall. I think we repaired to the sanctuary fairly quickly, didn't we?
and then we started hatching a plot.
But it was a very productive. I mean, it was a very
It was very
productive
productive.
few hours.
So I've been a long admirer of your music, particularly your choral music, and having
Oh,
sung a
thank you.
lot over the years. The choir had sung to the Field of Stars on our Patronal Festival concert some years ago, which was a fantastic piece. And that
Thank you.
really inspired me to approach you to write something substantial for our bicentenary.
Well, I was
Um,
very honoured to be, that you asked me, and thrilled, for such an illustrious and important, occasion as 200 years since the the foundation, I guess, of I mean, of the church. I mean, was it? I mean, how long did the church take to be built from its kind
It
of
was over a period of about 5 years.
Yeah,
I think it was 1819 to 1824.
brilliant. No,
So, uh, being asked to write a commission for a parish church in Australia, I don't think you've ever visited Australia, have you?
no, I haven't. No, I haven't.
Um, and for a choir you'd never heard, how does that sit with you? Where do you start?
Well, I think with anything, I think a lot comes from the conversations that, well, in this instance that we had about partly about practical issues. For example, the fact that we talked about level of difficulty, didn't we? And that I think you'd said that kind of to the Field of Stars, it was that kind of level would work. So
Yes.
and things like that. And I think talking about the size of the building and the other repertoire that the choir has, that kind of that enables you, I think, to kind of start forming an idea about what kind of thing will and won't work. I mean, if I'm writing people that I actually know, I mean, and I know what they sound like, and I know them, whatever. I do actually sort of visualize them sort of in the building or whatever, if I know the building as well. But if I don't, I just imagine all these things, and I sort of imagine them from some, from some evidence, but it's ultimately it's kind of imagined. But in a way, I think what one imagines is no less valuable than what's real, if you see what I mean. So it wasn't that weird. It wasn't that
Yeah.
weird, and I think, and I had a lot to go on, in terms of stuff that we talked about.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
mostly from our conversation, or do you find
yeah,
yourself going
yeah.
to Google to find out a little bit more? Or
I did a bit. I did, but actually, most of our conversation and just thinking about, I don't know, thinking about uh, just also thinking about Australia, because we did talk about it, didn't we? And I don't think we ever reached any conclusion about how Australian this piece should be. But I think one sort of thing, some things that I did sort of think about a lot was the idea of kind of bright sunlight and bright sunlight on stone. And I'm quite like kind of evoking kind of feelings of light and stuff anyway. So that was a definite thing, was to kind of think about a sort of almost a musical analog for that that idea of I mean, I don't know if the sun is particularly bright. I mean, in Sydney, I mean, I imagine it's like rather like that bright Mediterranean sun, but perhaps it's not.
it's very vibrant. It's very
Yeah.
bright. I mean, I don't think it is today. But so tell me then, the subject of actually St James himself. Does anything, having performed to the Field of Stars, I felt drawn to approach you because I felt that there would be an understanding of that aspect of our need. Did you consciously involve any of the same ideas as
To be honest with you, I'm
your
afraid I
Santiago
didn't.
piece?
I'm afraid I didn't actually. I suppose because of the Field of Stars, there is that kind of of having done a thing about Santiago. I suppose there is some sort of affinity, but I was thinking about other things actually, rather than actually St James himself. I was thinking about, as I say, I was thinking about ideas of light and space, and also actually thinking about actually the time of the church's foundation in the early 19th century, and thinking about actually also the sound world of orchestral masses then, which I mean, well, Beethoven Mass in C, I suppose, and it's a little bit later than Mozart and et al. But and thinking about that sound world with kind of quite particularly because we had quite a small orchestra because of the space situation.
Mm.
Thinking about that sound world with kind of quite forward woodwinds and wind instruments and small strings and stuff, and what that has, and then thinking about how that would work, and actually what you could do with an orchestra constituted along those lines. Because of course
Yeah,
we've got, and the colours and the way that and the idea again of quite spare, often quite spare and bright colours and stuff, which is again to do with light and I guess ideas of space as well in Australia.
mm.
Although
Yeah.
I know
So
Sydney's not particularly spacious, but I mean it's quite a spacious country, isn't it?
it is. Yes. So how do you approach setting the text of the ordinary of the Mass? Yet again, I guess it's something you've set quite a few times, but
I've done
with different parameters this time.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, I've done four other masters actually, but a this was particularly interesting because of the presence of orchestra, also the actual particular challenge, which was also interesting, is that it had to be there had to be an organ version of it as well, and thinking about how the organ. Because of the nature of the organ, which works in blocks of colours, how the scoring for orchestra would have to be in a kind of, rather than a kind of rather sort of very blended sort of 19th century-ish kind of orchestration, that actually again had to be these blocks of different colours, because that's how you render things on the organ. So that was something. But the credo thing, of course, was actually very interesting to me, because I've never been asked for a credo before. So that
Ah,
immediately made it particularly interesting. And also the length, that you wanted something of the length that you wanted, which is, again, much longer than any mass that I've done before. And thinking about actually how, then that becomes quite interesting, that actually how do you do something on on that scale, and how do you make it make things work over that kind of duration without it sounding as if you're just stretching it out for the sake of it.
yeah,
So those were kind of things that to think about, and that were particularly interesting. And yeah, but
yeah.
I
So
think also setting the same words that you set before, I think when they are sort of effectively ritual texts like that, I think that's not a problem, and it's quite interesting to go back, and because the great thing I think about these kind of these mass texts and canticle text stuff is, of course, that in a way, because they're so frequently set and so frequently sung and so frequently said and heard, you can basically do what you can actually do all sorts of things with them. It's actually quite nice. Actually, in a way you don't have to think about in the same way about how you're going to
hmm,
if you're setting a text that nobody's ever set before, I think you have a different relationship with it. So it's, in a way, you can do what you like, and I think so. It's. I mean, let's face it. Palestrina managed to how many masses did Palestrina write? Although they are all the same.
104, wasn't it?
Was it 104?
I think so.
So I suppose what I'm saying is that not. I mean, there were particular things about this which made it particularly unusual and interesting for me, especially the credo thing. But actually, I don't have a problem setting the same text.
Yeah, yeah.
More than
Okay.
once.
So I should explain to everyone that I approached you with a shopping list, basically. Um, I had a sort of preferred length. I mean, we the Sunday roast would be burnt if we went over an hour's worth of music on a Sunday morning. Um, uh, but we wanted something significant to celebrate our bicentenary. So a given length of 35 to 40 minutes, I thought was most appropriate. Uh, the size constraints of the choir and the orchestra dictated things to a certain extent, and the scoring. And I think, as you picked up on, the relevant thing here is I asked you whether you'd be prepared to write a version that could be adapted and played by the organ in to substitute the orchestra. Why did I do this? I simply think that if we had commissioned an orchestral mass, the chances of it being performed regularly because
Of
of
course, yeah.
resources and so on would be pretty slim, and the chances of other people being able to perform it would be much slimmer. So to have a version that can be picked up by a church or a cathedral choir and performed with organ would make it, out there and done a lot more.
I think, I mean, that would, but that was a particularly interesting challenge to actually, and to actually kind of to devise things which were, rather than having to make an organ transcription. I mean, in the sense that it is that, but it isn't really. I mean, they were sort of conceived to be performable by both forces from the word go, which is quite difficult, but it's also interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, you're renowned for your choral music, but you've written instrumental music. And in fact, I think I read that at the Royal College, you wrote more or less exclusively instrumental music. Am I right?
I did. I mean, I only came back to. I mean, I was a cathedral chorister, like you. I mean, were you a cathedral chorister?
No, I wasn't actually. No.
You were an A clerk at various places, weren't you?
Yeah.
Including the Abbey, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, the Abbey for 9 years.
Yeah. So I didn't really come back to it until about 20 years ago, or at least it started to really take off about 20 years ago in terms of working with voices. So, for the last 20 years, I've done much more stuff with voices. But again, I'm moving or trying to move a bit away from that, or at least I'm more interested now in actually things like this, in voices and instruments. And I've done, also what was supposed to be premiered last summer, but of course didn't, also because of COVID, was another big piece, this time with Symphony Orchestra for the Three Choirs Festival in Worcester, but that may happen this summer or it may not. So this also chimed, in a sense, with this project chimed with kind of what I was more interested in doing than straightforward a cappella or whatever, or choral pieces.
Yeah,
so that was also very exciting.
Okay, and I guess your experience from being a chorister at Canterbury, I think it was, and the exposure to particularly all the early music when you were a chorister, that's remained one of your strongest influences.
I think it has. I mean, I think those formative, those kind of childhood and when you're very young, those musical experiences are, well, all experiences are quite formative, aren't they? And I think, I mean, my favourite sound is still kind of, is voices in a nice acoustic. One of the results of that was, because I didn't know any, even actually more contemporary music, as a student, I didn't know. There's huge amounts of the repertoire. I mean, I knew a lot of early music, and I knew a lot about early music, and I knew a lot of 20th century music. But the intervening years where there isn't much that's performed liturgically from the 18th or the 19th centuries, really, I didn't know anything about. So that was another kind of legacy, which it's taken me, till now to kind of catch up with that. But yeah, and I think. I mean, I think you don't have to have had the experience of singing, either as a child or as an adult, to write well for voices. But it does help, I think, to have some experience of singing, because, the requirements of writing for the voice are very specific. And I always say to young composers, don't write for voices as they were instruments, because, I mean, I know Bach arguably did, but I mean, you shouldn't really, because they're very different things. So I think it's a particular skill, I think, to write well for voices, and it's very difficult to do probably if you've had no experience of singing at all.
Yes, yeah. So when you start to write this mass, do you conceive it as a whole and really map out the sort of links between the movements, or is each movement conceived very separately?
No, I do kind of. Well, the first thing to do, of course, is to decide how long each movement. So if you've got kind of 35 to 40 minutes, then how do you divide that up? How long should the credo be? How long should so to get the purport as well? Because I think we also did talk about it as a concert piece as well, didn't we? When we talked about it, and something that could be done in concert as well. so the first thing is always, I think, to think about the length of movement, and how they balance each other in terms of weight and duration and all those things. You've got some very short texts, so inevitably they're going to be shorter. The Kyrie, obviously the shortest text, and Agnus Dei is quite short, really. But then you don't want to make them too short. Credo, obviously, it's got to be the biggest movement because it's the most text. Clergy like a short Sanctus, don't they? So, or at least I've always been told. I've always been instructed, no, can't have a long Sanctus. So, those all things. So that's the first thing. And I think for musical reasons, it works quite well, I think, to revisit in the Agnus material that has been heard in the Kyrie. I don't know why. I suppose because they're both, although they're both sort of penitential in a sense, although of course there's a redemptive kind of ending, as it were, to the Agnus Dei with Dona Nobis Facem, but sort of redemptive. But so there's a connection there, and of course then you've got a kind of like a 5-part. If you've got a credo, it's symmetrical. So you've got the outer movement, or the first and other movements are sort of penitential, and then you've got 2 hymns of praise with the Gloria and the Sanctuses are both there, and then and the credo, which is obviously a statement of belief, which is kind of similarly, I suppose, kind of praise. Well, it's certainly not penitential. So to think about how you make all those things work and whatever. So
it's architectural, isn't it? You're creating a piece of art.
Yeah.
Is that how you see it?
And I also do imagine, I do visualize, I do see pieces as 3-dimensional objects. I mean, I couldn't describe them, which is probably why they're pieces of music and not 3-dimensional objects. But they do sort of, yeah. So I think architecture is very important, I think. I mean, because otherwise it doesn't really add up. You know what I mean? It's like and whilst, I think, it's important to kind of preserve some kind of spontaneity, I think, when you're writing, so you can kind of, but also if you've got no framework and no structure, to start with, then you'll just end up with a mess.
And then, are there any particular themes that you borrowed or that were inspired by anything particular that you used?
I don't think. No, I mean, I think not. Well, certainly not specifically. I mean, again, I think I've thought about those. Color was very important, and how to get, having then got this kind of quite colourful ensemble, because we've got some slightly interesting things. I mean, there's not a lot of percussion this day, but we've got the vibraphone and stuff, which is is quite nice. And also, I thought of flugel. I don't know why, but I just thought of flugelhorn as the only brass instrument rather than a trumpet. Say, I just thought that was an interesting, slightly different, rounder colour. It all kind of feeds into something, I think. Hopefully,
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I was also thinking, to be, as I say, wanted to be quite austere in some ways and quite spare. I mean, I think the textures are quite. It's not terribly lush. I think most of the music, which is kind of quite deliberate. I think and also, I wanted, for example, the Gloria not to be kind of. Well, some glorias are quite fierce and their exuberance and their joyfulness is a bit, and I wanted it to be a bit more of a kind of gentle kind of joyfulness, with these rather sort of, ecstatic sort of, but not, not too forced kind of jubilation.
Yeah. Gabriel, we are so excited to be able to perform your mass.
Well, I'm absolutely thrilled that it's happening, because it's the first thing that it's having, obviously, like everybody else, having everything cancelled and and whatever. This is kind of really exciting to me. I'm sorry that I won't be able to be there, but I think it's brilliant, and I can't wait to see it and hear your live stream on the 31st.
Well, thank you so much, and we hope that you might be able to come to Australia in the not too distant future.
Well, that would be fantastic. That would be fantastic. It's not going to be like this forever, after all.
No. Light at the end of the tunnel. Gabriel, thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.